Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
It was one of those thunderstorms that seem to go on forever. The kind where the sky flickers with violent flashes of light, and the rumble of thunder feels like the very earth itself is shaking. The kind of storm that makes your skin crawl and your heart race. That was the night Emma found herself stranded in a cabin deep in the woods. She had planned a quiet weekend getaway to escape the chaos of everyday life. It was supposed to be peaceful, a chance to disconnect and recharge. But when she arrived at the cabin, the storm was already brewing on the horizon. The caretaker had warned her about the weather, but Emma shrugged it off. She didn't expect the storm to hit as hard as it did. By the time the wind picked up, the rain started to pour, and the lights flickered. Emma realized just how isolated the cabin was. Her phone had no signal. The caretaker was gone, and she was completely alone. The thunder cracked and rolled, louder than any storm she had ever heard. It seemed to come from every direction, so close it felt like it was above her head. Emma tried to distract herself by reading a book in front of the fireplace, but the violent flashes of lightning outside kept pulling her attention. Then, just as a particularly loud crash of thunder shook the walls, Emma heard it, a faint sound, almost like a knock, but muffled. It came from the door. She froze, staring at it for a long moment. The wind howled outside, but the knock persisted. 3 quick raps, as if someone was waiting patiently. Her heart pounded in her chest. Who could possibly be out there in this weather? She slowly rose from her seat, her legs shaky. It could have been an animal, but it sounded too deliberate. She hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her. Maybe it was another traveler caught in the storm. She approached the door and slowly turned the knob. The wind hit her like a slap as she opened the door, but there was no one there. Just the swirling rain and the howling wind. Her eyes scanned the area, searching for any sign of life, but it was just a blur of trees and darkness. Emma felt a cold chill crawl up her spine as she shut the door, locking it tightly. She made her way back to the living room, her breath coming quicker now. Something didn't feel right. The storm was growing more intense by the minute, but there was still no sign of the person or thing that had knocked. Emma tried to shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her, but it was impossible to ignore. A few minutes passed and the storm raged on. Then the knock came again, but this time it was different. It wasn't on the door, it was on the window, right beside the fireplace. 3 sharp taps, followed by a scraping noise, like something dragging across the glass. Emma's blood ran cold. She slowly turned her head, her eyes wide with fear. She couldn't see anything outside the window, but the sound continued, scraping and tapping. She backed away from the window, but it didn't stop. It got louder, more insistent, like whatever it was outside was trying to get in. Then the power went out. The room was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the occasional flash of lightning. Emma's breath quickened as she fumbled around for a flashlight. She finally found it, flicking it on with trembling hands. But when she shone the light toward the window, she froze. A face, pressed against the glass. Dark eyes, wide open, staring into hers with an unblinking intensity. Emma screamed, stumbling backward. The flashlight dropped from her hands and rolled across the floor, its beam catching a glimpse of something else, shadows moving just beyond the window. Figures that weren't there a moment ago. Then came the sound of the door. It wasn't a knock this time. It was something much worse. The door creaked open slowly, as if someone was pushing it from the outside. Emma scrambled to her feet, heart racing, but she couldn't move. She couldn't scream. Her body was frozen with terror. The door opened wider. A figure stepped into the threshold. Not a person, at least not anymore. Its body was bent and twisted in unnatural angles, its skin pale and slick with rain. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the flashes of lightning outside. It stood there, staring at her, unmoving. And then it spoke in a voice that sent ice through her veins. "Let me in." Emma's mind raced. She had to run. She had to get out of there. But her legs wouldn't obey. The figure took a step closer, and the air around her grew thick and suffocating. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but the fear held her in place. The door slammed shut. Emma bolted upright in bed, gasping for breath. The storm was still raging outside, and the rain battered against the windows. She was in her apartment now, not in that cabin. But the terror was real. She felt it deep in her bones. She wiped the sweat from her forehead, trying to shake the feeling of the figure's eyes still watching her. But then her phone buzzed, and she picked it up, a message from an unknown number. The message simply read, "Let me in." Her stomach churned, and she dropped the phone, backing away slowly. The knock came again, this time from her door. It was the same 3 taps, and then the scraping noise.
Story number 2.
It was a quiet summer night when Jack, a college student, decided to take a late-night walk across campus. He had been studying for hours, and his mind was starting to feel heavy from all the textbooks and notes. The campus, usually bustling with students, was eerily quiet after dark. Jack figured a brisk walk would clear his head. The air was warm, the kind of night that was still, almost too still. As he walked past the old administration building, he noticed the dim glow of the streetlights flickering. He thought nothing of it. The building had been there for decades, and it had always had a certain haunting charm. But tonight, something felt different. There was a strange energy in the air, something unsettling. Jack continued down the path leading through the campus park. The sound of his footsteps echoed against the silence. The wind had died down, and the trees stood motionless. Then he heard something, a faint whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. He paused, looking around, but saw no one. The night was too still for someone to be nearby. Thinking he was just imagining things, Jack shrugged it off and kept walking. But the whisper came again, clearer this time, as if it were right behind him. He spun around, but there was no one, just the empty path lined with trees whose leaves barely moved. His heartbeat quickened. He wasn't alone. Someone or something was following him. Jack's mind raced. Maybe it was just a prank, someone hiding in the shadows. But as he quickened his pace, the whispers grew louder, more urgent, and they were now unmistakably voices. Low, guttural, almost incomprehensible, but Jack could make out a few words. "Come closer," it hissed. "We're waiting." His stomach twisted with dread, and he broke into a run. His legs pumped faster, but no matter how fast he moved, the voices followed, surrounding him, drawing closer. Jack didn't dare look back. As he rounded the corner of the park, he spotted a figure standing near the old fountain. A figure in a dark hooded cloak. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge Jack's presence. But as Jack sprinted past, something in the cloak seemed to shift. The hooded figure turned its head toward him, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The figure whispered, "You shouldn't have run." Jack's pulse raced as he bolted toward the nearest dormitory. He didn't dare look back. The sound of footsteps behind him seemed to echo in sync with his own, like they were closing in. When he finally reached the dorm, gasping for air, he slammed the door shut and locked it behind him. His heart was hammering in his chest as he pressed his back against the door. He stood there, trying to steady his breath, but the voices, those awful whispers, lingered in his mind. Jack thought he was safe, but when he glanced at the window, his blood ran cold. Standing in the shadows just outside, he saw the outline of the hooded figure. It was staring up at him, unmoving, as if waiting for him to come down. The next morning, Jack barely slept. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The campus seemed normal, too normal, and yet there was a strange heaviness in the air. As he walked across campus, he noticed something odd. All the students he passed seemed to avoid looking at him. Their faces were hollow, their eyes empty. It was as if they weren't even seeing him. He decided to head to the administration building. Maybe, he thought, he could figure out if someone had played a trick on him. But when he stepped inside, everything felt wrong. The hallways were dark, the lights flickering as they had the night before. Jack didn't understand why, but an overwhelming sense of dread settled in his chest. He took the stairs to the basement, that's where the school archives were kept. The old wooden door creaked as he opened it, revealing rows upon rows of dusty files. But as he stepped inside, his eyes were drawn to a row at the back of the room. It wasn't labeled like the others, and it seemed new. When Jack pulled the folder from the shelf, it felt heavy in his hands, like it was filled with years of forgotten secrets. He opened it, and his blood froze. The folder contained a list of students from the past century, students who had gone missing under strange circumstances. But then, toward the end, Jack's eyes widened in shock. His name was on the list. He had been marked as a missing person, dated for that very day. A cold chill ran through him. That was impossible. He hadn't gone missing. He was right there. He turned to leave the room in a panic, but the door slammed shut behind him. The whispering began again, louder this time, filling the entire room. It wasn't just one voice now. It was dozens, hundreds. Jack's pulse raced as the shadows in the room seemed to shift, growing darker, thicker. He could hear the voices growing closer. "You've been marked," they whispered in unison. "Come closer. We're waiting." Suddenly, the lights went out. In the pitch-black darkness, Jack could feel the air thickening around him, suffocating him. He stumbled backward, but there was no way out. The whispers became louder, more insistent, and the shadows seemed to close in on him. When the lights flickered back on, the room was empty. The door was ajar, and Jack was standing alone in the middle of the basement, soaked in sweat, trembling. He ran out of the building, his heart hammering in his chest, but no one seemed to notice him. That night, Jack didn't sleep. He couldn't. He knew he was being watched, stalked by something that wasn't quite human, something waiting for him to slip up, to disappear without a trace. The next morning, when he walked onto campus, he found that the entire school was gone, empty. The building stood tall, silent, but there was no one there, not a single soul. And in the distance, standing in the shadows of the administration building, he saw the figure in the hooded cloak once again. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and it whispered, "It's time."
Story number 3.
It was late, far too late for a phone call. Sarah had just finished her shift at the diner and was looking forward to a quiet night in. The air was cool, crisp with the scent of autumn, and the world outside her apartment felt peaceful. But when her phone buzzed, it startled her. The screen lit up with an unknown number, and she hesitated before answering. "Hello?" she said cautiously, thinking it might be a wrong number. A breathless voice on the other end responded, "Sarah, you need to leave." Now. Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't recognize the voice, and there was an urgency in it, something that made her blood run cold. "Who is this?" she asked, trying to sound calm but failing. "Leave your apartment. Go somewhere safe. You don't have much time." Before she could respond, the line went dead. Sarah stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear. She didn't know what to make of it. It could have been a prank, or maybe someone who had the wrong number. But the fear that crept up her spine told her that something was terribly wrong. She glanced around her small apartment. Everything was normal. Her jacket hung on the chair by the door, her books scattered across the coffee table. It all looked so ordinary. But that voice, that warning, it gnawed at her mind. She shook her head and laughed nervously. "It's nothing," she muttered. But just as she turned to go back to the couch, she heard it, a knock, soft but unmistakable. Someone was at her door. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't heard anyone approach. She slowly moved toward the door, peering through the peephole. All she saw was darkness, nothing but the faint outline of the hallway beyond. No one was there. Her hand trembled as she turned the deadbolt, feeling a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. She didn't open the door, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The knocking continued, more insistent now, almost as if it were a signal. Just as she was about to close the peephole, she saw something out of the corner of her eye. A shadow. It moved quickly, darting out of view. She gasped, but when she opened the door, no one was there. The air felt colder now, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She stepped into the hallway cautiously, her feet feeling heavy as she walked. There was no one else around, no sounds. The hallway lights flickered overhead, casting long, eerie shadows along the walls. Suddenly, her phone buzzed again, and Sarah almost dropped it in shock. The unknown number. Her hand shook as she answered, voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah?" The voice was back, but this time it was different. It sounded distant, far away. "You need to leave your building now. It's already too late." The connection cut off, and Sarah was left standing in the dimly lit hallway, a cold sweat forming on her skin. Her heart pounded in her chest. It was like something was happening that she didn't understand. Something terrible. She turned to head back into her apartment, but before she could, the elevator doors at the end of the hall opened. It was dark inside, but there was something or someone standing there. It was hard to make out at first. The shape was tall, unnaturally tall, with long, thin arms hanging loosely at its sides. It was impossible to see its face in the dark, but the outline of the figure seemed wrong. Its body wasn't proportioned like a human's. The arms were too long, the legs too thin. The thing slowly stepped out of the elevator, its movement jerky and unnatural, like a puppet with tangled strings. Sarah's breath hitched as she backed away, eyes fixed on the figure that was now standing at the end of the hallway. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there like it was waiting for her to make the next move. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move. Fear locked her in place. A sound broke the silence. The elevator doors slammed shut behind her, their metallic clangs echoing down the hall. She spun toward the sound and saw that the figure in the hallway hadn't moved. But now, something else had appeared. More of them. Tall, emaciated figures, standing in the shadows, their faces hidden, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Her mind screamed, "Get out! Get out now!" With all the strength she had left, Sarah turned and bolted toward the stairwell, her footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. She didn't dare look back, didn't want to know what was following her. But as she reached the door, she heard it, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps behind her, getting closer with every breath she took. She flung open the door to the stairwell and ran down the steps, not stopping to look behind her. Her chest burned with every breath. Her heart pounded so loudly in her ears that she couldn't hear the footsteps anymore. It was just the sound of her frantic breathing, the slap of her feet against the concrete. She reached the ground floor, her legs trembling beneath her. But as she pushed through the exit doors, she stopped dead in her tracks. Standing in front of her was another figure. This one was shorter, hunched, with a twisted smile that stretched far too wide across its face. Its eyes, a deep hollow black, gleamed with hunger. "Leaving already?" it rasped. "You'll regret it. We've been waiting a long time." Sarah couldn't move. The figure reached out a hand, long fingers curling toward her. She closed her eyes, bracing for whatever would come next. Suddenly, there was a loud, sharp bang, like a gunshot, but it was coming from behind her. Sarah turned in shock to find a man, wild-eyed, standing just inside the building. He was pointing a gun straight at the creature in front of her. The creature recoiled, hissing in fury. "Not yet, not yet. She's ours." The man didn't hesitate. He fired, again and again. The creature's body twitched and collapsed to the ground in a heap, but it wasn't gone. It was still twitching, its body slowly reforming like something that couldn't be killed. The man grabbed Sarah's arm, yanking her away. "You have to come with me. Now. They'll never stop. They'll keep coming." As Sarah looked back at the building, the elevator doors opened once more. Only this time, the hallway was full. The figures, dozens of them, were waiting for her, and she realized then that they weren't just after her. They were after everyone.
Story number 4.
It was supposed to be a quick weekend getaway, a break from the stress of her job and the city. Mia had booked a cozy little cabin in the woods, far away from everything. No distractions, just peace and quiet. But as soon as she arrived, she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was wrong. The cabin itself was charming, if not a little old-fashioned, with wooden beams and large windows that looked out into the dense forest. It seemed perfect for a solo retreat, but as the sun began to set, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. No rustling leaves, no distant animal calls, just stillness. Mia tried to brush it off. She unpacked, made herself a cup of tea, and settled in front of the fireplace. But even the crackling of the fire didn't seem to break the silence. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. As she sat in the warmth, a sudden, sharp noise echoed from outside the cabin. A twig snapping, followed by another, then more. It was the sound of someone, or something, walking through the woods. But that wasn't possible. Mia had been the only one to drive up here, and she hadn't seen any other cars around. No one should have been out there. She stood up, walking cautiously to the window and peering out into the darkening woods. All she could see were the silhouettes of trees, the shadows shifting as the wind picked up, but there was no sign of anyone, no movement. Her heartbeat quickened, and she pulled away from the window. "Get a grip, Mia," she thought, trying to calm herself. She wasn't going to let her imagination get the best of her. But as she turned back toward the fire, A chill ran down her spine. The air in the cabin had suddenly dropped in temperature. She grabbed her sweater and pulled it tightly around her, then heard it again. The sound of something tapping softly on the window behind her. Just once. Soft, almost like a gentle knock. Mia froze, her eyes widening in terror. Slowly she turned toward the window, heart pounding in her chest. No one. Nothing was there. She rushed to the window and yanked it open, hoping the cool night air would bring some relief, but there was nothing. Just the deep silence of the forest. That's when she heard it. A whisper, soft and distant but unmistakable. Mia. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She turned, her eyes scanning the room. The whisper had come from behind her. She was certain of it, but the room was empty. No one could have gotten in. The fire crackled louder, as though mocking her fear. She shakily picked up her phone to check the time, but when she glanced at the screen, her breath caught. The time was wrong. It was several hours ahead of where it should have been. How could that happen? Her phone had been set correctly when she first arrived. Confused, she opened her messages. There was a text from her friend, Claire, who had been the last person to text her before Mia left for the cabin. The message was short. Mia, stay safe. Do not open the door. Don't go outside. But that wasn't what sent a jolt of panic through Mia. It was the second message, sent just moments ago. Mia, I'm outside. Please open the door. It's me. Mia dropped her phone, her heart racing. Her hands trembled as she backed away from the screen. The air in the cabin was suffocating now, thick with an oppressive energy. She turned toward the door. Was Claire really outside? Mia couldn't remember when she'd last heard from her, but there was no way she'd driven up here in such a short time. Without thinking, Mia ran to the door and peered through the peephole. Her breath caught. There, standing in the shadows just outside, was a figure, a person. They were hunched, their features hidden in darkness, but something about them felt wrong. Mia, the figure whispered, in a voice that sounded eerily familiar. Please open the door. Mia's heart was pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She backed away slowly from the door, her body trembling. No, it couldn't be Claire. It can't be. Suddenly, the voice from outside changed. It was no longer pleading, but demanding, harsh and guttural. Let me in. You can't hide. Let me in, Mia. Mia's mind raced. There was no way she was opening that door. She didn't care if it was Claire or someone else. Something was horribly wrong, and she could feel it in every bone of her body. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Claire. Mia, it's not me. I'm trying to reach you. Don't open the door. There's something else out there. Please listen. Tears filled Mia's eyes as she stared at the message. She turned, her thoughts spinning out of control. What was happening? The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, darker, as though they were reaching for her. Then the door suddenly rattled. The knob turned, and the door groaned, as if something heavy was pushing against it from the other side. Mia screamed, stumbling backward. She darted to the window and looked out, hoping for some sign of safety. But what she saw froze her blood. A figure. A tall, gaunt figure standing in the center of the forest, its long arms stretched high, as though it were reaching toward her. It was impossibly tall, towering over the trees, its face a void of shadow, a dark mass where eyes should be. The whispering began again. Only now, it wasn't coming from outside the door. It was coming from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the air around her, all filled with that low, sickening murmur. Mia, 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 you can't hide. You can't escape. The door rattled again, harder this time, as if something was clawing its way through. The walls around her seemed to pulse with each breath she took. Panic overtook her. She had to leave. She had to run. She grabbed her things, scrambling for the door. But before she could reach it, the entire cabin went dark. The fire snuffed out in an instant, plunging her into complete blackness. The air was thick and suffocating now, and the whispers, those awful endless whispers, surrounded her. Then through the silence, a voice, clear and cold as ice, echoed from behind her. You should have listened. And then nothing. No sound, no movement. Just the stillness of the forest. The air was as empty as the darkness that had swallowed Mia whole.